So I thought I'd start out maybe by having us focus a little bit, possibly Joe Gilliam. I use some of your data that you supplied to me and your observations to kind of paint the overall IPO picture, but what additional granularity do you have, and what's your perspective past in the last 12 months or so, but also right now and kind of going forward?
Right. Well, first of all, the graphic art was not mine that you used in your presentation. Yeah, I think clearly we've been in a, I'll say 36-month positive cycle in terms of new, market issuance, and in 2014, as you rightly pointed out, was extremely strong. Rather than recapping that, I guess I'll make a couple points to that. The first is, it hasn't been a straight line, right? As many know, some of which in this room have successfully gone public and followed it very closely. We have seen fits and starts, right? Really starting in November of 2013, around some of the storms that happened on the East Coast, and the market pulled back. In 2014, it happened 2 or 3 times where largely the IPO market came very close to being shut, but still moving forward, and people still felt good about the market conditions. And what you saw was, as soon as the next quality issuance came out, a flood of deals came, and it continued to build momentum again and again, right, throughout the year. And I think as we go into 2015, or now we're pretty far into it, you rightfully point out it's been a bit more quiet, right? Some of the deals that came out in the first quarter struggled a bit. And so I would just conclude from all that despite a very strong market and a desire for deals and to put money to work in the IPO market, the quality bar is still quite high, right? And so not all deals are going to get done, but we still feel extremely constructive about where the market's at today, the health of it, the willingness to invest in IPOs as an asset class, and the likelihood for a year. I think you said it right, Bill, that this year is starting to shape up to look a lot more like 2013 than perhaps 2014.
Yeah.
And I can comment on the M&A side too as well if it's helpful. But
yeah, we'll cycle back
okay.
to that. We'll cycle back to that in a moment. Buzz, you your firm focuses, venture capital firm, more on devices than pharma. Is that fair? Why don't you give an overview quickly of your focus as an investor, and then comment about ophthalmology as a sector and how you view that.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So Sightline Partners, based in Minneapolis, we're a secondary direct investor, so a little bit different than a venture capital firm, but focused solely on the med tech and the diagnostic business. And what we do, the easiest way to think about it is we provide alternative investment ideas and alternative liquidity routes for existing investors in late-stage med tech and medtech and diagnostic companies. And it basically, the strategy has evolved over the last 5 years. We've done about 25 deals in the last 5 years in the medtech business, and it's really because of 2 things that happen in the business. One is, in the industry, one is there's a capital gap or a critical financing gap between how much capital is coming into the space and how much capital is getting invested. And if you looked at Bill's charts, last year in 2014, there's about $8 billion invested, but about $4 billion coming into the space. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason is the median time to exit for these businesses has increased to over 8 years, which is up about 70% over the last 10 years. And so the existing investors in these companies, good companies, but the existing investors have to put more money into each of those companies in order to get to an exit. So we step in as a secondary direct player and provide existing investors alternatives. So why do we like the ophthalmology business? And so we like the cardiovascular business, we like ophthalmology, and I wrote down a quick 10 points like the David Letterman style on ophthalmology. First, there's a lot of amount of deals and dollars invested in ophthalmology over the last 15 years. There's been about 650 deals, about $9.2 billion invested. In 2012, 2013 time period, there's about 90 to 100 deals in ophthalmology, about 2 million to 2.2 billion invested. If you compare that to cardiovascular, the same time period is about 140 deals and about $1.7 billion. So where there's a lot of deals and a lot of dollars being invested, that really works well for the investment model that we have. So that's kind of number one. Number two would be market size and the unmet needs and tremendous unserved needs. That continues. We'll hear about that all today. Three is just the demographics and the outside emerging markets outside the U.S. I think a real big reason we like ophthalmology is motivated patients. So patients will do everything possible to preserve their eyesight. Patients are accessible. They're looking for new innovative treatments. It's where they'll go out for elective procedures. They'll seek elective procedures as well as required procedures. The self-pay, a fifth reason, self-pay and private pay, lower reimbursement risks. This market has developed that a lot. I think a sixth reason is physicians are very innovative and they're early adopters of technology. They like innovation. They like to partner with venture capitalists. They like to partner with angels. They're willing to spend their time to have innovation come to the market, and Dick Lindstrom's a really good example of that from that standpoint. A seventh reason would be focused distribution channel. I mean, you can really cover, a small number of reps can cover the early adopters. Acquirers are willing to acquire earlier in the life cycle of these companies, which is good. High gross margins, and then I would say the last reason I wrote down was the IPO side. The last few years, the IPO side of the market has really rewarded investors, and it increased the ability to do exits from that standpoint.
Thanks, Buzz. Very, very thoughtful, insightful comments. Dick, you bridge a couple of areas here. Leading clinician for sure. You're an inventor, and you're involved, especially in early stage companies as well. Share your perspective on the sector, but specifically maybe share some of your perspective on areas you think need resourced. Where's the opportunity? Where's the unmet need?
I think a lot of the opportunity is driven by demographics, so I like to look at the demographics, and perhaps there's three major ones I think that are driving opportunity. One is the baby boomer, 78 million strong, and then we have the millennial, as I define it anyway, about 105 million strong, and then there's the distribution channel, which is the ophthalmologist and the optometrist, primarily in eye care. And so I look at those three demographics and what are their unmet needs and what help do they need, and I think that's where the biggest opportunity is. So for me, for the baby boomer, it's refractively presbyopia, and presbyopia is definitely the big opportunity in my opinion in the millennial. And then as you work into the eye, it's ocular surface disease such as dry eye and blepharitis, glaucoma, cataract, and then age-related retinal disease. And those diseases are going to grow significantly in number with a large demographic of 78 million baby boomers. On the millennial side, I think it's primarily refractive errors, and so spectacles, contact lenses, and refractive surgery. And we've certainly been lagging in refractive surgery, but if you look at the age that people wear contacts into the age that they give up their contacts and go into refractive surgery, we're about to approach that in the next 2 or 3 years, so I think we'll see another surge in growth in refractive surgery as well. And then we ophthalmologists and our colleague optometrists, we really are basically the distribution channel for every strategic that's in the room here. And our needs are electronic. There's a lot of IT opportunity, I believe, and then we need continuing support, if you will, in our practices as far as managing them well in the current environment, and then also giving our patients a positive experience. And so I think there's a real opportunity there in support of the provider as well.
Thanks, Dick. Emmett, obviously Claris, a leader, in the VC field, probably a little more pharma drug delivery than device, a bit balance. Why don't you kind of share your perspective and comment on the trends?
I'm not going to repeat what others have said. I will say in the pharma sector, I think there's still strong tailwinds. It's a good time, and it feels like that's going to continue. It's interesting, people talk about the innovation gap and how early funding is really challenging, and I still think that's the case on the device side. But I don't think it's the case as much on the pharma side. In fact, what has happened over the last 10 years is a swing away from later stage specialty pharma, incremental advances, twice a day to once a day kind of plays, and a swing entirely toward disruptive, innovative, first-in-class, best-in-class drugs. And that's, I think, primarily because the payers have said, we are only going to pay for important innovation. And so to make those innovations, you have to go earlier, and that's what firms are starting to do now. We'll see if it works. I personally think the science is at a stage where we can start to predict much better. We're driving toward genetically defined diseases. You see a drive toward gene therapy in those sorts of diseases. And when you have the compelling science and then you do the early experiments to get to proof of concept for a large unmet need, usually the strategics are interested.
Very good. Let's talk about M&A. So there's activity. I'd like to kind of blend the topic of what I think of broadly as industry leadership, which is precious and needed in any sector to fuel growth and innovation. So industry leadership, and also the M&A environment, if you will. So Joe, maybe you lead that off.
Sure. Well, a couple things. Obviously, first, we've been in a prolonged, stable macroeconomic environment. Cost of capital has remained, exceptionally low, and stock prices have for large acquirers have largely performed quite well. So all those things lead to a very robust deal-making environment generally. And one thing I guess I would add there too, which is, and for larger companies, the struggle to continue to grow above industry norms exists very much, even with all of those tailwinds. So that all leads to deal-making environments, and we're clearly in that part of the cycle where it's extremely strong. I think that a couple things. The first one is, I will say we're at that part of the cycle where the larger deal is in vogue, and we've seen that in this industry as well, right? But it's true across the landscape. The sheer number of mega deals, as we define them, north of $10 billion within healthcare over the last couple of years is reaching fairly unprecedented levels, right? And all those things I just described are contributing to that, but also, the market is rewarding those transactions. You see across the largest deals in healthcare, and the acquirer stock price reactions, despite what are very large transactions, are up on average 4 to 5% in the days that follow. So there's really a reward for putting that capital to work and putting the balance sheet of the larger acquirers to work. Alongside of that, we still continue to see record numbers of transactions, and I think that speaks to the sort of trying to find in every part of a landscape that leadership position, having the right technology, acquiring the emerging companies, the size of some of these acquirers, being able to go out and acquire an emerging company that gives you that opportunity, even earlier stage, as you describe in terms of the maturity, is very much a part of the strategy. And the only thing that happens when you're in the part of the cycle where you've got these large deals is, at any given time, a large deal can happen, and that clearly can take an acquirer out of the game for a certain period of time,
yeah.
Right? So.
And that's really an interesting implication. Something that I tend to watch personally, and I think in the field we tend to watch, is when there's a major transaction, there's a quiet period for that organization as it absorbs, integrates, and stabilizes after a large transaction. We've seen it in various sectors, and we tend to monitor and track that. We almost have metrics on that. So it's really interesting if there's instability in the leader, or change, doesn't mean it's negative instability, but if there's change in the leadership structure, there can be a real ripple down effect. Now, if you have an IPO market that has less tough implications, but we went through an extended period where the IPO market was way quiet, and there was some change in the leadership structure, and guess what? It was hard to keep our projects funded during that time. And there's an inefficiency in the venture capital market where there's a lag between performance and investment. And so it's really a fun and a bit intimidating, complex metric that we often chase. And Emmett, you made the comment that early stage devices are harder to fund, your sense, than early stage pharma. Give us a pro and con. What do you think? Why is that the case?
I just wanted to add before
Yeah,
I touch
please.
on that the not to underestimate the catalytic effect of the public markets.
Yep.
It is an amazing effect. The source, the amount of capital, and the facility of getting that capital is just so much greater. It sucks everything up from the bottom, and it's a wonderful thing to have an active public markets. Without that, it really pushes down. And everybody expects the cycle, but then you hear analysts say, well, we're in a new. The cycles will be different. I think there still will be cycles, but the question is, how blunted will they be? How big will they be? Will we still always have a public market for good companies, not exceptional sort of out of the norm companies? And maybe we can come back to that, because I think it is sort of a discussion. Devices have the benefit typically of having maybe a clearer thought line from unmet need to how to solve it. It's a very mechanical thought line often, and it should work. But in reality, it costs about as much, and you know this better than I, to develop and take to approval a device, especially if you have to go through the PMA system, as it does many drugs in ophthalmology, because the drugs have self-selected for those that have smaller trials and cost $100 to $150 million to get to approval. And so the devices cost the same amount of time or money, they take the same amount of time, but then at the end, you have, for a drug, a $500 to $1 billion market versus a device where you have a fraction of that. And and to layer on top of that, just for I guess for reasons that are clear to them, the device companies have said, well, we're not going to take on this risk. We're going to wait and let you de-risk it, and in many cases, we're going to let you launch it and de-risk it from a commercial sense, not just technical. And if we like what we'll see, then we'll step in and we'll do an interaction or an exit. And if there are no public markets in that setting, that's a long way and a lot of money to go. So I'm intellectually, I like devices, but historically, I think it's been challenging. You would have much more direct comments than I, Bill. You've done it for a lifetime.
Well, and I think those are very relevant, and I appreciate hearing your perspective on that. I share many of those perspectives. Dick, again, you have a broader perspective than some of us. You're involved in a number of private company boards and a number of public company boards. Tell us a little bit about that transition for these companies going from private to public. No big deal, right?
Well, actually, in the last couple of years, it's been pretty fun transition, because the companies that have gone public have been, really rewarded. So it's pretty fun when you go public and your stock price doubles or triples. It's not quite as much fun when it comes down the other way, which as we move through the economic cycles may well occur. But it's just been, I think, too good an opportunity to acquire capital at a good value through the public markets to turn down. And so many of the private companies have looked at that opportunity, and so that transition has been, so far a positive one. But it definitely changes things, because the cost to operate goes up. There's a lot more regulation. Your CEO spends a lot more time talking to investors and perhaps less time focused on the products, and so it's not all a win. And I might mention one other big trend that I think is meaningful, and that is the movement towards patient-shared responsibility for the cost of health care, or, if you will, the cash pay sector. And I think that's a critical thing to take a look at, I think, for someone who's getting ready to invest as well. And I really see a strengthening of the cash pay sector. And interestingly enough, as a provider, perhaps the best thing that ever happened to cash pay was actually the Accountable Care Act, Obamacare, if you will, with the high deductible plans. Because even now at the lower economic levels, we have a large number of patients who are paying more than they ever would have anticipated they might out of pocket for their health care. So cash pay is another, I think, area to look carefully at.
Sources of capital in the public markets that seems like they're again being rewarded. What do you see, Joe, in terms of where's the capital coming from, and what other sectors possibly outside of healthcare are feeling the pinch?
Well, it's true, and actually one of the things we track on our side is the amount of capital in some of these individual funds, right? And so we know a lot of these names, whether it be Fidelity or Wellington, et cetera, and all the individual PMs within those. A lot of these folks who might have been 4 or 5 or 6 years ago running $2 billion worth of money might be running $20 billion today, right? Part of that is the performance of the overall markets. Part of that is their performance and the capital influx coming from all the traditional sources, whether that be, pension funds or others. And so, for those folks, they have to put that money to work, right? And in increasingly larger ways. It's one of the reasons why you see an interesting dynamic that happens in the IPO market, where sometimes you see these deals that are incredibly successful, and you scratch your head maybe even at the outcome of the valuation. And I think part of that's because it starts, when you have a successful transaction, it starts to move away from even some of those direct fundamentals and more about the overall putting capital to work equation, which as a book runner or a bank is a great place to be in. And so for those situations, people want to write, an individual investor who used to might want to write a $5 or $10 million check now wants to write a 25 or in some cases increasingly $50 million check, right? If you're going to have that equation in play, you really have to have a much larger transaction. So that's why you see these deals, especially on the biopharma side, getting upsized, where it's a couple $100 million they're raising at much larger valuations, because people want to put that capital to work.
Yeah, very good. Buzz, you have a specific strategy in the med tech side of tracking companies that are doing well but are taking a long time, and investors need to gain liquidity. You come in and move forward. What's your timeline, round numbers, target, and reality to from investment to exit versus the traditional timelines? Why don't you give us a perspective?
Yeah, so we target late stage opportunities, and we do track, and we're very proactive on approaching companies. And the companies, the targets that the attributes of the companies we go after are companies that have either FDA approval, but for sure CE mark approval, companies that have products that meet an unmet need in the marketplace. Most of the time, they're commercial, in fact, at least for some small amount of money. But the really important thing is we want to exit within 3 to 4 years. And as part of our due diligence, we identify who we believe are the buyers of that company ahead of time. So if you look back in medtech world, not biotech, but medtech, 86% of all the VC-backed companies in the last 8 years exit from an M&A standpoint. So we're really targeting M&A. The public markets, strong public markets really, really help that from that standpoint. But the reality is most of the med tech companies are going to get acquired, and so that's how we structure it. And to date, we've done about 25 deals. We've had about 8, 9 exits, and we've been able to hit that target from that standpoint. So
yeah. Very good.
We feel pretty good about it.
Please.
That, Bill, because I think it's an important point. I think most of us intuitively know this, but the bar is different for medical technology companies to go public, right? It's just plain and simple. The metrics, the experience of the public investor universe with medtech IPOs is far more limited if you just look at the sheer number of IPOs in pharma versus medtech. And they tend to be looking for companies that have commercial presence, right? And some scale attached to it, not just early success, but $20, $30 million of revenue and growing beyond that. They tend to apply more traditional valuation metrics, a little less likely to look out 5 years.
So it's not the price to dreams, it's the price to revenue.
It's judged by a different, and frustrating for many medtech executives.
Really?
No,
it's not frustrating.
But yeah, no, I think it's in general it's a higher bar, if you will, in terms of where you have to take that company to access the public markets. There's always exceptions for different reasons, but by and large.
Quite frankly, that's one of the reasons why it's taken the median time to exit has gone up so much on the device side, is that in order to access the public markets, you have to have a stronger revenue and a growth rate, and in order to get acquired, the acquiring companies want to have more of the milestones accomplished before they'll pull the trigger.
Yep, definitely contrast between the IPO side on the biopharma versus med tech. We're going to wrap up now and transition to something that's one of the features of the day, and I think one of the more fun sessions, and it's going to be the Ophthalmic Company Showcase. This will be moderated by Rosewyn Brooks from Zeiss and Tracy Valori from Bausch & Lomb. So I'm going to thank the panel and invite the moderators for the next session. Thank you.